Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I, Zafar Parkar, student of Standard 12th from Islamic International School and Junior College, and today I am going to be giving a presentation on the topic The Collapse of Evolution, Debunking the Myth. So, what does evolution mean? The theory of evolution suggests that life is a product of uncontrolled and purposeless process of coincidence. So basically the theory of evolution, it means that life and the entire universe, including the solar systems, the earth and all the organisms, they have just come about by chance. So let's speak about a few important people who have defended this theory. The first person to actually take up this theory, that is the theory of evolution, seriously was a French scientist, a French biologist by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. In his theory, he suggested that living things transferred the traits they acquired during their lifetime to subsequent generations. So in his theory, he suggested that giraffes evolved from antelope-like creatures which extended their necks to reach the higher branches of trees. And the second person, important person and probably the most famous person when it comes to evolution is the British amateur naturalist by the name of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, in the 19th century, in 1856, he published a book called The Origin of Species, and he suggested that all organisms, they have descended from a common ancestor. So in his theory, he suggested that all species have descended from one common organism, from one common ancestor. So according to him, in his book The Origin of Species, which was published in 1856, he claimed that all species have descended through a common ancestor by chance. So according to him, all the species, like the birds, the species of the birds, the mammals, the reptiles, they all have a common ancestor. So these are the two most popular people when it comes to evolution, that is Lamarck and Darwin. So now let's understand, why did they think so? I mean, why did they think that such a complex thing like life could just come about by chance? When we study their research, we find one similarity, that their conclusions were based on primitive understanding of science, and their research was done with primitive equipment. Like for example, this is one of the primitive microscopes used. So now these equipments, they didn't have high magnifying power like the microscopes. Because of this, they thought that life is something that is relatively simple, and so it could come about by chance. So because the understanding of life was primitive, this led them to come to this conclusion that life was really simple, and by coincidence it could just spring into existence. But as we know now, we have more sophisticated equipment, microscopes with high magnifying power. We come to know that life isn't simple at all. In fact, it is very complex. So let's go deeper into the topic. Mostly whenever this topic of evolution is spoken about, the idea of man evolving from apes, it comes to mind. However, before that can be spoken about, a very important question has to be answered, and that is, how did life begin on earth? Because apes and then apes turning into men is something that's really far away. First we have to understand the origin of life. How did life start on earth? And one such theory that was proposed to explain this was the theory of spontaneous generation. The theory of spontaneous generation, it suggests that living things, they just sprung out of inanimate objects. But a very famous biologist, French biologist by the name of Louis Pasteur, he did an experiment on this and he totally disproved that theory. And this was his experiment. What he did, he took a flask and he filled the flask with some broth, and then he boiled it. Why did he boil it? Because boiling will kill any microorganisms that are already present in it. And then he attached an S neck to the flask. to ensure that no organisms can get inside from the outside. And then he kept the broth like that for 1 year, and when he observed the broth, he found there are no microorganisms in it. When he removed the S-neck, now once the S-neck is removed, the broth is now exposed to all kind of external factors, and any microorganisms from the air can get into it. So after some time, when he observed the broth, the mixture, he found microorganisms in it. So by this he concluded that living things cannot just spring out of inanimate objects. And he wrote in his conclusion for his test that the belief that animate objects or life can spring out of inanimate objects has been buried in history for good. So once the scientists realized that spontaneous generation is totally baseless, they turned to something else called natural selection. So what is natural selection? Natural selection basically means the survival of the fittest, which means that the animal or the organism that is best adapted to its habitat survives. However, this theory or this concept of natural selection has no evolutionary mechanism as Darwin had claimed. Because let's take the example of a deer. A deer is hunted by a cheetah. A deer cannot outrun a cheetah. But no matter how many deers are hunted by a cheetah, even though it cannot fight a cheetah back or it cannot outrun it, a deer remains a deer. It does not turn into some other organism that is basically, let's say, stronger than a cheetah or faster than a cheetah. So natural selection, it doesn't have any evolutionary mechanism. And one very famous example given to support this theory is called the moths of the Industrial Revolution. Now, before the Industrial Revolution took place, in London there were basically two kinds of moths, the light colored moths and the dark colored moths. And before the Industrial Revolution, as you can see, the light colored moths were more in number. Their population was more compared to the dark colored moths. After the Industrial Revolution, vice versa. The number of dark colored moths increased and the number of white colored moths decreased. Now, what was the reason for this? The reason was that before the Industrial Revolution took place, the air was clean, and so the bark of the trees, they were light in color, because of which the light colored moths would easily hide on it. They would get easily camouflaged, and the dark colored moths, they would be eaten by predatory birds. After the Industrial Revolution, when the air became polluted with soot particles and smoke, the bark became darker in color. What does this mean? This means that the dark colored moths are now hidden, camouflaged, and the white colored moths are exposed. Thus, their numbers dwindled. So as we see, natural selection just causes the rise and fall in the population of organisms, but it does not have an evolutionary mechanism. It does not cause a change in the organism itself, as Darwin had claimed. When scientists understood that even natural selection has no role to play in evolution, they turned to mutation. Now, what are mutations? Mutations are basically alterations that take place in the genes of an organism due to some external factor like ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is radiation which has the capability to rip electrons of atoms. However, scientific evidence points to one clear fact, and that is mutation does not benefit an organism. In fact, it only causes harm. Let's take, for example, the frog on the top left. It has two legs on one side. Now, this does not benefit the frog in any way. In fact, it just handicaps it. Or if you can see the example of the turtles who are conjoined twins, again, it is no benefit. So as we see, mutations, they show no benefit. They do not cause a beneficial change in an organism, which is evolution. And if you see the nuclear disasters that have happened in the past century, in the 20th century, like the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the Chernobyl disaster which happened in Ukraine when the nuclear reactor burst, the after effects and the mutations that were caused on human beings, they were not beneficial at all. In fact, they were painful to the human beings on which they happened. And There are many examples of mutations even today, like dwarfism, then you have the Down syndrome or cancer, and even science tells us that these mutations, they do not benefit an organism. So in conclusion, we can say that to tell that mutation causes a beneficial change is like saying that you can improve a clock by smashing it with a hammer. I mean, that does not happen at all. Then we move to the topic of intermediate forms. Darwin, when he put forth his theory, he said that if my theory be true, then numerous intermediate forms must assuredly exist. Now, what are intermediate forms? Let's take the example of man evolving from apes. Let's agree for the sake of argument that it did happen. So according to Darwin, if that is the case, then there must be intermediate organisms. What does that mean? The half ape, half man like creature. However, in this world we find millions of human beings, millions of apes, but we cannot find even one half man, half ape. Similarly, scientists, when they say that fish evolved from invertebrates like the starfish. So leave aside modern organisms, even if we see the fossil records, we see and we get the fossils of a perfect fish and a perfect starfish. But you cannot find the fossil of even one half fish, half starfish. So intermediate forms cease to exist. They do not exist. But there is one bird that has caused much excitement among the evolutionists, and that bird is called the Archaeopteryx, the picture on the left. Now, the scientists, they say that reptiles, they evolved into birds. So dinosaurs, they evolved into birds because dinosaurs were reptiles. And they call the Archaeopteryx as the missing link between dinosaurs and birds because it had teeth in its beak and it had claws on its wings. However, just because an organism which is of one species, it exhibits the characteristics of another species, doesn't mean that it's an intermediate form. These type of creatures are called mosaic creatures in science. And one such example of a similar bird is the hoatzin, which lives in the Amazon forest. It too has claws on its wings. And probably the most famous example of a mosaic creature is the duck-billed platypus. Now, the duck-billed platypus is a mammal which has a beak like that of a duck, which is a bird, and it lays eggs. But yet it is a mammal. So it's a mosaic form, not an intermediate form. It's not evolving or it has not evolved. It's just a perfect creature. And William Fix, who is a very renowned scientist, he says that when we examine the fossil records, we do not find gradual evolving of species, but we find the explosion of one species at the expense of another. So even scientists agree that intermediate forms cannot be proved with hard fossil evidence. So, as we saw that Darwin and Lamarck, they based their conclusions on primitive research and primitive understanding of science and of course primitive equipment. But as we know now with the sophisticated equipments that life isn't that simple. And a very famous scientist by the name of Fred Hoyle, he compares one single cell, not even a tissue or an organ or an organism, he compares one single cell to a Boeing 747, which is the jumbo jet passenger airliner. And a Boeing 747, it consists of some 6 million parts. And he compares one cell to a Boeing 747, and he says that one cell is even more complex. It's even more complex than a Boeing 747. And he says that the probability of higher life forms evolving is the same as a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747 with the materials therein. And that doesn't just happen. And leave aside tornado sweeping through a junkyard, even if you kept finished parts in one room for infinite amount of time, for example, if you kept the turbine and the blades and the stabilizers of the plane and the electrics and the cables, the wires, it still wouldn't assemble into a perfect Boeing 747. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Baqarah, chapter number 2, verse number 26, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَسْتَحِي أَن يَضْرِبَ مَثَلًا مَا بَعُوضَةً فَمَا فَوْقَهَا. Indeed, Allah is not shy to strike the example with that of a mosquito or something that is even smaller than that. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is telling us that any small organism, even a mosquito or a cell, is clear proof that He has created it and it has not evolved or come in by chance. But perhaps the most spoken about topic when it comes to evolution is man's evolution, of man evolving from apes. However, this, like the rest of the theory of evolution, is just a tale. It's not true, and it again does not have any scientific evidence to prove it. In fact, the alleged ancestors of man, like the Homo erectus, the Neanderthal man, or the Homo habilis, none of them are half man, half ape creatures as portrayed in the books or in films or movies or documentaries. They are just human beings, and some of them are just extinct ape species. So the alleged ancestors of man are either a lost human race or extinct ape species. And when the cranial features, the features of the brain, of the skull, was studied of one of the ancestors of man, the Homo erectus, they found that it wasn't any less developed than that of a modern human being. And a famous evolutionist, Derek Ager, he mentions that today's scientists and popularizers have the audacity to portray the evolution of man as a fact, as if there is no doubt whatsoever about it. And then he concludes by saying, only if they had evidence, only if they had evidence to prove it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Taghabun, chapter number 64, verse number 3, خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ وَصَوَّرَكُمْ فَأَحْسَنَ صُوَرَكُمْ وَإِلَيْهِ الْمَصِيرُ. He created the heavens and the earth, and He formed you, and He made beautiful for you your form. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling that He did not create us from apes, or we did not evolve from apes, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us as perfect human beings, and we are the descendants of Adam alayhi salam and not the descendants of apes. Let's say what some famous scientists have to say about this theory. Evolutionary biologist by the name of Douglas Futuima, he mentions and he quotes that organisms either appeared on earth fully developed or they did not. If they did not, they must have developed from pre-existing species by some form of modification, which is evolution. And then he says that if they did appear in fully developed state, as we saw that organisms, they appeared in fully developed state, then they must indeed have been created by some omnipotent intelligence. And that is what we believe, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is most wise than us, He is the one who has created everything. And another interesting quote by paleontologist of Harvard University by the name of David Pilbeam, he says that if you brought in a smart scientist from another discipline and you showed him the meager evidence for the theory of evolution we have got, he would say, forget it, there isn't enough to go on. So that is what he says, that the evidence to prove this theory is so little that in no way can it be said that it's a fact. Then we go to a very interesting section in the theory, and that's hoaxes and frauds. As we discussed that evolution has no scientific evidence. So sometimes the evolutionists and the scientists, they have done is that they have cooked up evidences from their own, because they know that there is no fossil records to prove it. And there are many famous hoaxes, and I'll be speaking about 4 of them. First, let's see about the coelacanth. Now, the coelacanth, it's a fish that was claimed by scientists to be the ancestor of land animals. So they claimed that this fish was extinct some 70 million years ago, and it was the first fish to start life on land. So basically, this fish was the first one to come on land, and they said that it had a primitive breathing system to work in air out on land, and it even had a primitive walking mechanism to walk on land. However, on December 22nd, 1938, a live coelacanth was found in the Indian Ocean, and this was a shock to the evolutionists. In fact, one scientist, he mentioned that I wouldn't have been more shocked even if I came across a living dinosaur. So that's how shocked they were, because they claimed that this fish was 70 million years old. It had become extinct 70 million years ago, but they found a live one. And in the coming years, they found some 200 more coelacanths. But the funny part is that scientists claim that this was the ancestor of land animals. As the first fish to actually come on land and start life on land, actually they found out that this fish usually stayed some 180 meters below the surface of the water and rarely came to the surface. Then we come to the experiment of Stanley Miller. Stanley Miller, he conducted an experiment, and what he basically did was he combined a few gases which he thought existed in primitive earth before life existed on earth, to see whether it could give rise to life. And when he mixed the gases in his equipment, lab equipment, it gave rise to amino acids. And since amino acids are the building blocks of life, he concluded that evolution is true. However, he later accepted that the experiment was a hoax and it had no basis when it came to science. So this is a table to compare Stanley Miller's experiment, the real condition, and why is his experiment invalid. The first point is that he used gases like methane, ammonia, and water vapor in his experiment, whereas primitive earth, it had nitrogen and carbon dioxide. And his experiment is invalid because when the tests were performed with the actual gases, no amino acids were obtained. The second mistake he made was that he thought that oxygen wasn't present in primitive earth. In fact, there was a lot of free oxygen in primitive earth, and if there was oxygen, it would have destroyed the amino acids. And Stanley Miller, he was a very clever guy, a very shrewd guy. What he did in his setup, he had this mechanism called the cold trap. What this did, that as soon as the amino acids were formed, it preserved it. And of course, this mechanism could not have existed on earth at that time. So even if we agree for the sake of argument that amino acids had been formed, they would have been destroyed very easily by the forces of nature. So as we see, his experiment was totally invalid and it cannot be taken as a proof for evolution.